My name is Helen, and I recently turned 30. Looking back, I realize how much I believed in the power of love, convinced that it could fix everything, especially the man I chose to marry. His name was Scott, and he had his fair share of issues, which I thought I could help him overcome. I thought that if I just loved him enough, he'd find his self-worth. But love, I learned the hard way, can't do that. It can't make someone love themselves. Scott was obsessed with gaining the approval of his parents, an obsession that went far beyond simply wanting to make them proud. His entire existence seemed shaped by this need for their validation. Mr. and Mrs. Kyle, his parents, however, were indifferent at best, which only made his craving for their attention more desperate. It was heartbreaking to watch. Over time, I realized I couldn't fill the emotional emptiness they left in him. What made matters worse was Scott's reckless spending. He would drain our savings on lavish gifts and vacations for his parents, things they hardly appreciated. It often felt as though I was competing for his attention, trying to hold on to what was left of our relationship while his parents consumed his every thought. Despite the constant conflicts and frustration, I still loved Scott. I hoped, almost naively, that one day he'd break free from their suffocating expectations and find peace within himself. But it became painfully clear that no amount of love could save him from the influence of his parents. Then came the day when Scott, wearing a serious expression, told me he needed to talk. With everything that had happened, I braced myself for another disagreement. This one, I feared, might be the worst yet. "Helen, I need to tell you something important," he said, his voice unusually solemn. "What's going on?" I asked, my heart sinking, dreading whatever was about to come. "It's about my parents. They're retiring soon, and I want to surprise them with a luxury vacation. It's going to be expensive," he said, his face a mix of excitement and anxiety. "That sounds like a nice gesture," I said, trying to keep my voice calm, "but I don't think we should dip into our joint savings again. It's really important we stick to our budget." "I don't have enough saved up to cover it," he admitted. "I was hoping we could use some of our savings." "Scott, if it's more than we can afford, maybe we should think twice," I said gently, trying to bring some reason into the conversation, but my words only upset him. "You don't get it, Helen," he snapped. "I love my parents. I want to do something special for them. Love isn't about counting pennies, it's about making grand gestures." I tried again, but love is also about being practical, and making sacrifices together, not at the expense of our future. "I have to do this for them," Scott insisted. "I thought you'd understand, they mean everything to me." "They're not the only ones who matter," I said, my frustration starting to build. "I love you, Scott, but we need to be realistic. We can't blow all our savings on one trip." He didn't see it that way. He accused me of being selfish, of not understanding the importance of his gesture. "It's not about being selfish," I countered. "It's about being sensible. We can't just throw away $35,000 on a whim." "You're being heartless," he shot back, completely dismissing my concerns. "No, I'm being realistic," I said, feeling a growing distance between us with every word. "This isn't how things work." The argument grew more intense, with emotions running high. Things were thrown in anger, objects shattered, and amidst all the chaos, Scott dropped a bombshell. If I couldn't support him, he wanted a divorce. I was stunned, but instead of reacting with panic or begging him to stay, I simply looked at him and said, "Okay, Scott, if that's really what you want." His face shifted from anger to shock. He had expected me to beg, to fight for the marriage, but instead, he was met with calm resolve. I was done. I couldn't keep sacrificing my peace for his endless pursuit of approval from his parents. If he was going to chase an unattainable dream, he could do it alone. He tried to argue, but I stopped him with a raised hand. I couldn't continue fighting for a love that was always weighed down by unrealistic expectations and the need for constant validation. "Go ahead, spend every last penny trying to win over people who barely notice you," I said, my voice steady as I made the final decision to end the cycle of disappointments and broken promises. In that moment, the truth hit him like a ton of bricks. Our marriage had turned into a battlefield, and it was time for both of us to surrender and find peace on our own terms. A month has passed since our divorce was finalized, and I can honestly say that the freedom feels indescribable. The endless arguments about finances and the futile chase for approval that was never ours to claim are now behind me. I can finally breathe, unburdened by the weight of his insecurities that once dominated my days. Every new morning feels brighter, lighter. Scott has tried to reach out, acting concerned, asking how I'm doing, but I see through his act. I've learned my lesson. As the saying goes, fool me once, shame on you. Fool me twice, shame on me. I turned my back on his attempts to rekindle what we once had. I realized I'd spent too much time trying to fix someone who wasn't interested in changing. It was time for me to focus on my own happiness and growth. Rebuilding my life wasn't easy. Splitting our assets and adjusting to a new financial reality took patience and grit. I had grown accustomed to a certain lifestyle, but I embraced the challenge of reshaping my future. In the process, I discovered strengths within myself I never knew existed, reconnecting with old friends, revisiting hobbies I had neglected, and exploring new interests opened up a world of possibilities. I was determined to make this fresh start count. Sure, there were moments of self-doubt, loneliness, and the struggle to adapt to a tighter budget. The scars from my failed marriage didn't vanish overnight, but with every passing day, I found peace in knowing that I no longer had to sacrifice my happiness for someone else's insecurities. It was almost startling how easily I moved forward. It was as if I had been clinging to a relationship that was destined to fail for far longer than I'd realized. Once free from that emotional weight, I was amazed at how much I could accomplish on my own. A month into this new chapter, I still had moments of adjustment, but I felt more empowered than ever. Then, Scott's messages took a strange turn. He claimed he was in trouble and urgently needed to meet. Skeptical but curious, I decided it was time to address the situation head-on. I called him. "Scott, we've been over this. We're divorced. It's time to move on," I said, firm and unwavering. "Helen, please, I need a moment to explain. I'm in serious trouble, and you're the only one I can turn to," he pleaded, his voice desperate. Maybe there was genuine fear, or maybe it was the absence of his voice that made it sound more convincing. A part of me felt a flicker of concern. Despite everything, I couldn't help but wonder if he was truly in danger or if this was just another one of his manipulations. Against my better judgment, I agreed to meet him. "Fine," I said, "but we're not meeting at my place. Let's go to that cafe we used to frequent. No tricks, got it?" "Thank you, Helen, I promise. I just need someone to listen. You're the only one who understands," he replied, his tone one of relief. You might wonder why I agreed to meet him at all. Honestly, I questioned it myself, but sometimes, even after everything, curiosity and a lingering concern compel us to act against our better judgment. Despite the divorce, a part of me still cared. So there we were, sitting across from each other in the familiar cafe, the scent of coffee filling the air, but even the cozy atmosphere couldn't ease the tension. Watching Scott, his face tense with anxiety and those sad eyes trying to pull at my heartstrings, almost made me laugh. This time, however, I was unmoved. I leaned back, composed, in control. I was ready to listen, but on my terms. "All right, Scott, you've got my attention. What's this danger you're supposedly in? But just so you know, I'm not here to save you. I'm done cleaning up your messes, Scott," I said, my tone firm but calm, signaling I was willing to listen, yet resolute in my decision to not fall back into old patterns. Scott sighed deeply, his face a mixture of regret and desperation. It was almost pitiful, but I steeled myself against any emotional manipulation. "Helen, I know I've messed up before, but this time it's different. I've gotten involved with some really dangerous people. I owe them a lot of money, and they're not exactly patient," he confessed, his voice tight with fear. I raised an eyebrow, skeptical. "Really, Scott? Dangerous people? Are we revisiting the story of your imaginary enemies again?" My disbelief was evident as I leaned back, folding my arms across my chest. His expression shifted, a flash of hurt crossing his face, as though he expected sympathy. "No, Helen, this is real. I'm in deep trouble, and you're the only one I can turn to," he insisted, desperation creeping into his voice. I shook my head, unfazed. "Let me guess, this all started after the divorce?" I asked, already piecing together the predictable aftermath of his decisions post-separation. Scott went on, his voice rising, a sense of urgency overtaking him. Before I knew it, my own voice was elevated too, and soon the entire cafe was witnessing our conversation. I shot a quick, apologetic look toward the other patrons, trying to regain some composure. "I know I've made mistakes," Scott continued, "but this mess is bigger than me. I don't know what to do." Frustration flared up within me. How could he just waltz back into my life with yet another crisis? But despite my irritation, a part of me still couldn't completely block out the lingering sympathy. "How much are you in for, Scott?" I asked, bracing myself for the worst. $120,000, he mumbled, almost too embarrassed to meet my gaze. $120,000? Are you out of your mind? I erupted, my voice louder than I intended. I didn't care anymore about the curious stares from nearby tables. If they were listening, they understood why I was angry. "Helen, please," Scott begged, his eyes wide with desperation. "I've got nowhere else to turn. You're the only one who's ever believed in me." I stared at him, feeling a momentary flash of the man I once loved, but it quickly faded. I had nothing left to give him, not now. Not after everything. "Don't try to pull at my heartstrings, Scott. It's too late for that. When you said you needed help, I thought it might be $20,000, not $120,000. You've completely lost it, I said, frustration mixing with disbelief. Scott's shoulders shook as he began to cry, completely unaware of the discomfort of the people around us. Scott, get a hold of yourself. This is not the place for a scene, I said, keeping my tone firm but controlled. What's going to happen if you can't pay it back? I asked, though I already dreaded the answer. They're threatening me, Helen. They'll hurt me if I don't pay them back. I'm serious. This is bad, he said through sobs. His words hung in the air, a heavy weight that tugged at my conscience. But as much as I felt a faint flicker of concern for him, I couldn't ignore my need to protect myself from being dragged back into his chaos. Seeing how real his fear seemed, I reluctantly softened my approach. All right, Scott, tell me everything. Start from the beginning. He took a shaky breath, then launched into the story of his ill-fated attempt to fund an extravagant trip for his parents. He'd borrowed money from unreliable sources, trusting a friend who ultimately betrayed him. The result was a pile of debt with no way out. I listened, my frustration bubbling under the surface. Part of me couldn't help but feel a dark amusement at the absurdity of it all. So, you borrowed money from dangerous people to impress your parents, who hadn't even noticed your efforts. Is that what happened? I asked, trying to untangle the mess he'd made. Scott's face fell, and tears flowed freely as he acknowledged the painful truth. Yes, ever since they came back from that trip, it's like I don't matter to them anymore, he said, his voice thick with regret. I felt the anger rise in me again, but there was a part of me that couldn't ignore his remorse. It was a hard lesson for him to learn, and seeing him so devastated stirred a reluctant sympathy. You've really dug yourself into a hole, Scott, I said, my voice calm but firm. I know you don't want to hear I told you so, but you've made your own bed. I warned you this was a bad idea. You chose this path, even after I told you how it would play out, and now you're stuck. You've put everything into trying to win your parents' approval, but all you got in return was their indifference. It's a tough lesson, but it's one you had to learn. I paused, my words laced with a mixture of concern and resignation. It was a bitter truth for both of us. Scott had tied his self-worth to people who never appreciated him, and I had to accept that I couldn't shield him from the consequences of his choices. I had always been on his side, but he had placed his value in the wrong things. Now, this was his mess to clean up. The silence between us grew heavy, thick with the weight of the past, our broken promises, unfulfilled dreams, and the regrets that had settled like dust between us. In that moment, I knew it was time to let go for good. No more second chances, no more attempts to fix what had long been beyond repair. Scott had to face the consequences of his actions on his own, and I needed to move forward and find my own happiness, free from the chaos of our past. I hope you figure this out, Scott, I said, my voice carrying a tone of finality. Wait, you're not going to help? He asked, clearly caught off guard by my response. No, I replied, without hesitation. Why not? He pressed, his desperation unmistakable. Because I don't have the money to bail you out, and even if I did, going into debt for you again, taking on a loan I'd still be paying off for years, isn't something I'm willing to do. I explained, my tone unwavering. I can't afford to be as reckless as you've been. Please, Helen, I'm begging you, he said, his voice cracking with emotion. I shook my head, feeling my patience wear thin. Scott, it's not realistic to expect me to fix this, especially after everything. You're my ex-husband, not my responsibility. Yeah, I expected you to help. You're not my enemy, you're my ex-wife, he muttered, still holding on to a flicker of hope. But it was clear now that we had become two people living entirely separate lives. My priority was finding peace and happiness, without him. And that's exactly the problem, I said, leaning forward slightly. You always expect me to clean up after you because I did that when we were married, but I can't, and I shouldn't, keep doing that. It's not my job anymore. A pause lingered, and then I added, after everything, I don't owe you anything, especially after how you wasted our money on your ungrateful and toxic parents. But I love them, Scott said, his voice softening, almost pleading. And I love myself, I replied, my voice steady. Loving myself means doing what's best for me now, which includes protecting my well-being. Scott looked down, realizing that he wouldn't be getting the help he so desperately wanted. There was nothing more I could give him, and it pained me to see the depths of his hopelessness, but I couldn't let his desperation pull me back into his spiral. With a quiet sigh, I offered one last piece of advice. It seems like you're out of options, so here's one suggestion: leave. Go somewhere far enough away where they can't find you. I don't know what else you're asking from me. He sat still, the weight of my words sinking in. He was upset, angry even, but I knew deep down he understood. This was the end of the road. This is it, Scott, I continued, my voice clear and final. We're going our separate ways. I can't keep getting entangled in your messes. We both need to find our own peace. His voice wavered, bitterness creeping in. If you really cared, you'd help me. I shook my head. I'm saying goodbye, Scott. I'm changing my number, too, I said, standing up, my resolve firm as I turned and walked away. I left him there, sitting alone, his expression a jumbled mix of frustration, sadness, and maybe even a touch of realization. It wasn't easy, but it was the only choice I could make, for my own happiness and dignity.